This happened roughly 5 years ago when I was 22, and it remains the most terrifying experience of my life. I was home from college for Christmas break, staying with my parents in the quiet Midwestern town where I grew up. Their neighborhood was a peaceful, suburban area, the kind where people knew each other's names and often left their doors unlocked during the day. It felt safe and serene, which made what unfolded that night all the more unsettling. My parents were hosting their annual Christmas party, a tradition as far back as I could remember. The usual crowd of friends and family filled the house, with Christmas music on repeat, an abundance of food, and a steady flow of wine. When it got too crowded inside, the festivities often spilled out onto the front yard and sidewalk. That year, I wasn't in much of a social mood. I'd recently gone through a tough breakup and had planned to stay upstairs most of the night. But my mom convinced me to come down and help greet the guests. By 7 p.m., the party was in full swing. I stood near the entryway, sipping spiked cider and making an effort to avoid small talk, when I noticed something odd, a man in a Santa suit standing in the front yard, just beyond the glow of the Christmas lights. At first, I assumed he was part of the party, maybe my mom had hired someone to entertain the kids. She had a habit of going overboard with Christmas cheer. But as I watched him, I realized he wasn't interacting with anyone. He just stood there, motionless, staring toward the house. I nudged my mom, who was chatting with a neighbor. "Hey, did you hire a Santa?" I asked. She frowned, shaking her head. "No, why?" I motioned toward the yard, but when I looked back, he was gone. Feeling uneasy, I brushed it off as a misunderstanding. The rest of the night carried on as usual, with laughter, drinking, and guests sharing stories. I even started to relax a bit. Around 9:30, I stepped outside for some air. The front yard was empty now, most of the guests had moved to the back patio. As I stood on the porch, enjoying the quiet, I noticed something chilling, footprints in the snow leading from the sidewalk to the house, stopping just below the living room window. A shiver ran down my spine. Someone had been standing there, watching the party through the window. I glanced around but saw no one. The sense of being watched lingered, and I went back inside, locking the front door, something my parents rarely bothered to do. By midnight, the party wound down, and most of the guests had left. My parents, a little tipsy, were laughing as they tidied up the kitchen, while I went upstairs to my old bedroom. I planned to watch Netflix until I fell asleep. About an hour later, I was drifting off when a noise outside caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The snowstorm had been steady all night, and the trees near my window often creaked in the breeze. But then I heard something heavier, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and crept to the window. Pulling the curtain back slightly, I froze. There he was, the man in the Santa suit. He was standing in the yard again, staring directly up at my window, motionless. The red suit and white beard glowed faintly under the street lamp. Panicked, I stepped back, unsure of what to do. Waking my parents didn't feel right. I knew they'd dismiss it as a prank. Instead, I texted my best friend, "There's a guy in a Santa suit in my yard again. What do I do?" She urged me to call the police immediately. Still hesitant, I glanced out the window again. This time, he was closer, standing at the edge of the porch, his head tilted slightly as if trying to see inside. Shaking, I dialed 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line while officers were sent to my house. "Is he still there?" she asked. I peeked through the curtain, but he was gone. "No, he's not," I whispered, my voice trembling. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. After I explained what happened, they searched the yard and nearby streets but found nothing. They suggested it was probably a prank and left. I couldn't sleep after that. Every noise made me jump, and I kept imagining the man's figure in the snow. The next morning, my mom called me downstairs, her voice unsteady. At the front door, She pointed to deep scratches on the doorknob, gouges as if someone had tried to force it open. We stepped outside and saw more footprints in the snow. This time, they circled the house, stopping at every door and window. I called the police again. When they arrived, one officer listened carefully as I described the man. His expression turned serious. "We've had a few reports of a man dressed as Santa watching people through their windows," he said. "We've been trying to catch him, but he disappears before we can. That was the last we saw of him. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but even now, the sight of a Santa suit sends a chill down my spine." It was Christmas Eve when I was 16, and the events of that night remain etched in my memory. I grew up in a quiet, close-knit town in upstate New York, where everyone knew everyone, and crime was almost unheard of. I'd always felt secure there, especially during the holidays, when the snow blanketed the streets, and houses glowed warmly with Christmas lights. But that night, the sense of safety I'd taken for granted was shattered. My parents had gone to a Christmas party at a neighbor's house, and I opted to stay home. I wasn't in the mood for small talk with adults sipping wine. Instead, I planned a cozy evening on the couch, watching horror movies with popcorn and hot chocolate. The snowfall outside was heavy, creating a serene stillness. The only sounds were the occasional creak of our old house and the faint whistle of the wind. I'd turned off most of the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the Christmas tree to illuminate the living room. The warm ambience was comforting. Around 10 p.m., I paused my movie to grab more popcorn from the kitchen. As I walked back into the living room, something outside caught my attention. The large picture window overlooking our front yard usually offered a picturesque view of the snow-covered trees and Christmas decorations. But this time, it revealed something chilling, a man standing at the edge of our yard. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or someone passing by. But he wasn't moving. He stood there, still as a statue, partially obscured by the falling snow. I could make out his tall figure, clad in a long coat and what looked like a hat. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but he remained motionless, facing the house. A cold unease crept into my stomach. I tried to rationalize it, maybe he was lost, or waiting for someone. But why would he just stand there in the snow, staring? I decided to close the blinds, telling myself that out of sight meant out of mind. I tried to resume my movie, but my attention kept drifting back to the window. The unease gnawed at me until, after about 15 minutes, I couldn't resist checking again. I didn't pull the blinds up completely, just peeked through one of the slats. My heart skipped a beat. He was closer. Now he was standing halfway up the yard, closer to the house. He was still completely still staring. My pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. Grabbing my phone, I texted my mom, "Is anyone supposed to come by the house? There's a guy outside, and it's freaking me out." She didn't reply right away, likely distracted at the party. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I checked again. He was even closer now, standing at the edge of the porch. Only the front door and a pane of glass separated us. In the dim light, I could make out more details. His long black coat was dusted with snow, and his hat cast a shadow over much of his face. But I could see his mouth, stretched into an unnaturally wide smile, as if he found some twisted amusement in the situation. Terrified, I locked the front door, my hands trembling. I double-checked the back door and windows, ensuring everything was secure. Then, armed with a kitchen knife, I sat in the living room, phone in hand. Summoning the courage to glance out the window again, I was relieved to find the porch empty. The man was gone. Yet the relief was fleeting. My nerves remained on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he might return. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom, "No one should be there. Lock the doors just in case." "We'll be home soon." As I began typing a reply, I heard it, a faint, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the living room window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head. Through the closed blinds, I could see the faint outline of a figure standing on the other side of the glass. He was back. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I sat frozen, clutching the knife, unable to move. Then came another sound, the rattle of the doorknob. Snapping out of my paralysis, I dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries. The operator's calm voice helped steady me as I described the situation. She assured me officers were on their way and instructed me to stay on the line. The tapping stopped. The doorknob grew still. For a moment, all was silent, save for my ragged breathing. Then I heard it, footsteps crunching through the snow, moving deliberately around the side of the house. "He's at the back door now," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car appeared outside. 2 officers arrived, their presence a wave of relief. They searched the yard and surrounding area but found no sign of the man. The fresh snow had covered most of the footprints, though a few faint tracks leading up to the house were still visible. The officers stayed with me until my parents returned. My mom was horrified, repeatedly apologizing for leaving me alone. The police believed it might have been someone attempting to break in. But I knew this was more than that. Burglars don't just stand in the snow, staring into windows. And they don't smile like that. That night, I didn't sleep. Even now, every Christmas Eve, I find myself looking out the living room window, wondering if that man is still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. This happened about a decade ago, and every Christmas, it comes back to me as if it just happened. I was 18 then, living with my mom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Our family wasn't particularly festive after my parents' divorce, but my mom insisted we attend a Christmas party at her best friend Karen's house. Karen's place was in an upscale part of town, big, beautifully decorated, and filled with holiday cheer. I didn't want to go at first, but my mom guilted me into it. I figured I'd make the best of it by scrolling through my phone and sneaking some spiked punch when no one was watching. The party was exactly what you'd expect, a lively gathering of parents laughing and drinking while their kids raced around the house. I wandered from room to room, nibbling on appetizers and avoiding small talk. Eventually, I found a spot in the living room, scrolling through social media, tuning out the party's hum. That's when I first noticed him. At first glance, he seemed like any other guest, mid-40s, average build, dressed neatly in a black coat and slacks. But there was something off. He wasn't mingling or chatting like everyone else. Instead, he stood near the fireplace, holding an empty cup and scanning the room. His eyes moved slowly, methodically, as though searching for something, or someone. I tried not to stare, but his presence unnerved me. He didn't have the casual, cheerful vibe of the other guests. He seemed too focused, too alert. I glanced around, expecting someone else to notice, but no one did. Shrugging it off, I decided he was probably just one of Karen's quirky acquaintances. About half an hour later, I was in the kitchen grabbing a soda when I spotted him again. This time, he was standing outside the sliding glass door leading to the backyard. Snow was falling heavily, and he was silhouetted against the glow of the outdoor lights. I froze. He wasn't smoking or talking to anyone. He was just standing there in the snow, staring into the house. His gaze felt deliberate, and for a moment, I thought he was looking straight at me. My stomach knotted, and I quickly left the kitchen, telling myself I was overreacting. I went back to the living room, looking for Karen to ask about him, but I couldn't find her. I tried to distract myself by chatting with some teens near the staircase. That's when a little boy, probably 6 or 7, came bounding down the stairs, laughing and squealing like kids do when they're playing hide and seek. He stopped abruptly in the hallway, his laughter fading. "Hey," the boy said, pointing toward the stairs. "Who are you?" I turned to see what he was talking about, and there he was again. The man in the black coat was standing halfway up the staircase, staring down at us. My heart skipped a beat. His face was expressionless, his posture unnervingly calm. He didn't seem embarrassed or startled to be caught upstairs, where he clearly didn't belong. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly on the banister, watching us. The little boy frowned, clearly unsettled. "You're not supposed to be here," he said loudly. An older teen laughed nervously. Dude, why are you upstairs? That's off limits." The man didn't reply. He tilted his head slightly, as if pondering something, then turned and walked back up the stairs. The air was thick with tension. "Who is that guy?" I whispered. "Maybe he's Karen's brother or something," someone suggested. But Karen didn't have siblings, or at least none I'd ever heard of. I'd had enough. I went to find my mom, who was chatting with Karen in the dining room. I waited until I had her attention, then whispered, "Mom, there's a weird guy here." He was upstairs. Karen overheard and frowned. "What guy?" I described him, the black coat, the blank stare, how he'd been on the staircase. Karen's face went pale. "There shouldn't be anyone upstairs," she said, her voice trembling. "We only invited family and close friends." My mom tried to brush it off, suggesting he was a guest's husband or plus one. But Karen shook her head. "I know everyone here. No one fits that description." Karen's husband, Dan, overheard us and decided to check it out. He grabbed a few other men and headed upstairs while the rest of us waited at the bottom. Minutes passed, the sound of doors opening and closing echoing through the house. Finally, Dan returned, looking irritated. "No one's up there," he said. "We checked every room. But I saw him." I insisted. Dan dismissed me with a wave. "Probably just someone who wandered where they shouldn't. Let it go." I wanted to argue, but my mom gave me a look that told me to drop it. For a while, the party resumed. People laughed and drank, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself Dan was right, that it was nothing. Then someone realized Ryan, a little boy about 5 years old, was missing. The party came to an abrupt halt as everyone began searching. We combed through the house, the yard, even the nearby street. No sign of him. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ryan was found in the basement. The door, which had been locked all night, had been pried open. Ryan was sitting at the bottom of the steps, crying. When asked what happened, he kept saying, "The man told me to wait down here." "What man?" Karen demanded, her voice cracking. Ryan sniffled. "The man in the black coat. He said he needed to find his family." My blood ran cold. The police arrived and searched the house. They found the basement window open, with footprints leading out into the snow. The officers speculated it was a drifter who snuck in, possibly to steal something. But nothing was missing. To this day, I can't stop thinking about that night. Whoever that man was, he had been in the house for hours, moving unnoticed among us, watching. We were lucky Ryan was found. I shudder to think what could have happened if he hadn't been.